Mr. Castillo, a longtime cafeteria worker and licensed gun owner, was pulled over for a broken tail light and was seen on the police dash cam notifying the officer of the presence of a weapon in the car and assuring him that he was not reaching for the gun. Within a matter of seconds, the officer had fired 7 shots, killing Mr. Castillo. 2 narratives began to quickly arise from this case that are common in many police-involved shootings. One of those narratives was that the officer was in fear of an imminent threat to his life, and although sad, if the victim had followed the officer's instructions, they probably would be alive today. While the other narrative, so eloquently spoken by Mr. Castillo's mother after the jury verdict acquitting the officer, expressed the belief of many people of color in this country. The system continues to fail Black people and will continue to fail us, she said. Regardless of which side you are on, there are 2 startling facts related to that case that speaks to serious issues within our justice system. First, Mr. Castillo had been pulled over 49 times in 13 years before his death, or an average of every 3 months. And according to the New York Times, it's believed that this case was the first time in the history of Minnesota that a police officer was tried for a fatal on-duty shooting. Within a couple of weeks of that verdict, as I had done many times in my career, I reached out to my friends at the Philadelphia Bar Association, including then Chancellor Debbie Gross, with an idea for a program about policing, which turned out to be today's program. What I came to the Bar Association with was an idea, but with the leadership, support, and knowledge of the Philadelphia Bar Association and the members of Take Action Philly, we created an informative program that many people worked together for months to bring to you today. This was a diverse group of leaders that I was incredibly honored and humbled to work with, and without everyone's commitment, this event would not have been possible. Today's program will consist of 2 panels and a keynote address by Professor Angela J. Davis, the author of Policing the Black Man. The first panel will explore the legal and historical framework for police-involved shootings, moderated by Chief Defender Keir Bradford-Grey, and features panelists Professor Hannon, Professor Marie Gottschalk, and Professor Donald Tibbs. Angela J. Davis will talk to us in her keynote address about questions we should be asking about the criminal justice system, police shootings, and proposed solutions. The second panel will be moderated by myself and focus on the institutional constraints on investigations of police-involved shootings, and will feature panelists, the new District Attorney, Larry Krasner, Brian Abernathy, First Deputy Managing Director of the City of Philadelphia, and Executive Director of the Police Advisory Commission, Hans Minos. So without further ado, I would like to invite Chancellor of the Philadelphia Bar Association, Mary Platt, to say a few words.
Thank you, Nikki, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mary Platt, a lawyer at Lyman, Kretzstein & Harris, and the Chancellor of the Philadelphia Bar Association. On behalf of the Philadelphia Bar Association, I welcome you here today and appreciate your overwhelming interest in today's program. I want to thank the Free Library for allowing us to use this space. And I also want to thank the Take Action Philly partners for collaborating and sharing their time and talent in order to organize programs dealing with topics that are of interest and importance to Philadelphians. Their names are listed on the sign to my left over here. I ask that those who helped make today's events possible, please stand so that we can recognize you. Before we start the program, I'd like to give you some background on Take Action Philly, or TAP as we affectionately call it. Last January, the Philadelphia Bar Association, led by former Chancellor Deborah Gross, and the Public Interest Law Center, led by Denny Clark, formed Take Action Philly, also known as TAP, with the support of the City of Philadelphia, the private bar, and several nonprofit legal aid organizations. TAP is an initiative that unites lawyers, government, community organizations, and residents to offer protection and assistance to the city's vulnerable population. Together, we have worked to identify ways to become involved and engage in response to federal and state policy decisions that impact city residents. Last February, TAP held its first convening focusing on immigrant and refugee issues facing Philadelphians. The Philadelphia legal community was represented at the convening by more than 500 attorneys, reflecting a high interest among our bar to use their skills to help immigrants and refugees. The panelists addressed the anticipated impact of federal and state policy decisions regarding immigrant and refugee affairs and organized a call to action for members of the legal community and community at large. In response, TAP coordinated more than a dozen free citizenship screenings and clinics to assist with citizenship applications. The Philadelphia Bar Association also created and hosted a number of continuing legal education courses to train members of the legal community to assist with these screenings and clinics. More than 200 attorneys volunteered with these screenings and clinics, which helped more than 200 immigrants become legal residents. In June, TAP hosted a second convening, right here in this room, focused on Medicaid. The Medicaid program provides health insurance for about 2.9 million Pennsylvanians. It's the largest payer for nursing home care in the state. It's a critical driver of jobs and an essential component of our healthcare system. The convening addressed how Medicaid works, how lawmakers might cut the program, which populations are particularly at risk of losing coverage, and how lawyers, advocates, and citizens can work together to protect this life and health-saving program. And now we are here today at the third TAP convening on yet another timely topic which is of the utmost importance, race and justice in the 21st century. I look forward to hearing our keynote speaker, Professor Angela J. Davis, as well as all of our panelists. If you'd like to learn more about the Philadelphia Bar Association, please visit phillybar.org. I'd be remiss if I didn't encourage you to join or renew your membership in our association so that you can connect and work with lawyers and judges in Philadelphia on issues that impact the legal profession, our legal system, and the rule of law. Thank you again to our speakers and everyone who has made this program possible.
Thank you, Mary. I will call up the first panel, Professor Tibbs, Donald Tibbs, Professor Hannon, and here we go. There you go. Good evening, all. I'm so happy to be here and excited about this panel. As we were talking about the topics of discussion, I think all of the passion around these areas oozed out of our pores, and we had a wonderful planning discussion. So I'm really hoping that you guys will get out of it what I got out of it, which was a feeling of excitement that we're going to explore opportunities to really take action. But before I do that, I want to really send a special thank you to the TAP committee for inviting me in to discuss this. Reggie Schuford, thank you so much for your leadership. And Nikki Johnson-Houston, who I love, she's a tax attorney who is socially and consciously woke. I love her. I really do, because I think that she uses everything in her background to expose just injustice and wants to take action and brings in people that can help. So without further ado, we will go into this panel discussion. I'm going to just give you a brief overview of the speakers that we have and the type of work they do. Professor Hannon, he's a Villanova professor in sociology and criminology, and as a criminologist, Dr. Hannon's research has documented how the dramatic rise in imprisonment rates over the last few decades has ultimately caused more crime and poverty. And I know you guys, some of you may be familiar with his most recent research publication, and that had to do with stop and frisk in the African American community. It is a practice by the Philadelphia Police Department, and he's here to shed some light on that. Professor Marie Gottschalk, she's a professor who specializes in American politics with a focus on criminal justice, health policy, race, and the development of the welfare state and business labor relations. And Professor Donald Tibbs, author of From Black Power to Prison Power, The Making of Jones, the North Carolina Prisoners Labor Union, and the co-author of Hip Hop and the Law. Tibbs is a historian and scholar who studies race, law, civil rights, and criminal procedure. So, let's talk about how we take action in some of these areas. But before that, we need to hear more information to make us better informed of some of the problems. When we discussed what this panel was going to be about, we wanted to talk about not only police-involved shootings, but the mechanics of why can't we hold police officers accountable. And I'm not just talking about from the stakeholders who make the decision to indict, but I'm also talking about from the standpoint of lay people or potential jurors who have this understanding or viewpoint of police officers' actions and somehow justify their actions as reasonable or normal under the circumstances. So Professor Tibbs, as we discussed yesterday, we have seen a lot of things that have now made it into the common household discussion. It's not that this is new, but it's being videotaped and shared more widespread. And what we've seen are some really troubling results after we understand that something wrong just happened. I think all of us, lay people, lawyers, researchers, whomever, can look at a video and say, this is just wrong, and I hope justice is served. And when you see the results of, say, the Philando-Castillo verdict, it leaves you with a feeling of no hope. So I would like for you to please, could you discuss the types of accountability that we could have if we have a society where we don't allow a narrative to justify the outcomes, and what the standards of liability are when a police officer is on trial for wrongdoing?
Thank you for this opportunity to speak this evening. It's really nice, wonderful to meet everyone. And I'm going to try to sort of answer that question here with, and leave some of you all with a little bit of hope. It won't be much so by the time I'm done. So part of the problem is a legal issue and a social issue, right? The legal issue actually arises from the way that we treat homicide in this country, statutorily, right? So it's a problem associated with the way that the laws are actually written, which is why it's important to be in contact with our legislature at the time that they're making these types of decisions. Now, I always sort of start by explaining to my students that in a very simple, most pared down way, and this is not going to be very complex, even though I realize there's some complexities, that there's certain things that you cannot do. One of the things you cannot do is use force against another human being. If you use force against another human being, that is a crime. It's called assault and battery. If you use deadly force against another human being, then it is an even greater crime. It is a crime. It is a homicide. The only way that assault and battery and that use of force or that use of deadly force will be excused is if somehow it is justified. The justification actually arises in how we look at self-defense law, which is part of the narrative that comes out all the time in these police-involved shootings. That one of the things that the law says very specifically, whether it be use of force or use of deadly force, is that you can use whatever amount of force is necessary to propel whatever force is coming towards you, just so long as you act in a reasonable way, number one, and you have to have a certain reasonable belief of bodily harm. If you're going to use deadly force, then you have to have a reasonable belief of death or great bodily harm. For the standard person, for everyone in this room, that measurement of reasonableness is an objective one. The objective standard basically holds that everyone else would have to agree, looking at the same set of facts, that your belief is somehow reasonable or that it makes sense. And that's a very difficult standard for the average citizen, which is why it's difficult for us to escape homicides when we commit homicides. But for police officers, they have the same measurement, except in their case, they are measured by the reasonable police officer. And herein lies the problem. That for us, it is an objective standard, whereas for police officers, it starts to sound more like a subjective standard. In other words, what would a reasonable police officer have believed in this particular situation as it pertains to fear of death or great bodily harm? So that presents a huge problem for us legislators. Now, the greater problem on top of that is also that not only is that standard really immersed sometimes in the narratives themselves that play out with police officers. This is part of the reason that you often hear them say, for example, I was in fear of death or great bodily harm. When Michael Brown was running towards me by more than 20 feet away, I feared for my life. Boom, there it is. And if they can meet that standard, then the homicide would be justifiable. Now, who are we going to ask as it pertains to the reasonableness standard for police officers? Well, we're going to have to ask other police officers, right? And so these other police officers, this is where the other portions of the social impact of and the social aspects of justice kick in, right? This is where the sort of the blue walls kick in. This is where hiding evidence. This is where never turning your back against your brethren. All those things that create problems in terms of being able to get at the truth become problematic for us. Now, if that's not bad enough, let me add that there's actually statutes, that it is actually statutorily written that in most states, police officers have a specific statute that applies to the use of force just for police officers, which makes sense, right? Because they have to use force when they're effectuating arrests, etc. But when we get to the portion of the statutes, example in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, Section 508, when you look at the standard here, it almost reads like a stand your ground law. It almost reads like a stand your ground law. Not only does it present a standard, a subjective standard for police officers, but there's absolutely no requirement to escape or to retreat. And when you don't have a requirement to retreat, that is almost a basis for stand your ground, which basically means there's no need to de-escalate. Since there's no need to de-escalate because I'm not required to retreat and I'm judged by the standard of everyone else that's going to back me up whenever it comes to trial in terms of my reasonableness and measuring my reasonableness, it is lock, stock, and barrel for police officers to be able to get away with these types of crimes.
Professor Tibbs, what you're saying is so poignant to the standards and the things that the legislature allows us to do. But what about our social consciousness, right? So we're talking about situations where we view, in Walter Scott, a person running away and fleeing and being shot in the back. And the jury having a hard time convicting on the first go around. We saw Philando Castile, right? And we still have a situation here that happened, early spring with David Jones, where we still have no understanding of what's going on with that case. How is it that we normalize this behavior and justify it in that if the officer uses force because someone didn't obey, or someone didn't stop, or God forbid, someone's running away because they owe child support, that it is necessary to keep us safe?
Yeah, I mean, the complex answer is slavery. The more simple answer is to be able to think about how narratives of crime and criminality connect to race and connect to the people who are most often being policed. And if you look at those scenarios like Walter Scott and Philando Castile, there's a long-standing narrative regarding black male criminality that dates all the way back to slavery. It was part of the justification for slavery, moving forward through Jim Crow all the way into the Civil Rights era into the present. That long-standing narrative regarding black male criminality and criminal deviance means that in the moment that the African-American male is failing to comply with the officer's request, he's somehow being criminal. He's somehow being deviant, which means he somehow deserves what he gets, which is just a fancy way of saying he committed suicide. But when we're not talking about that particular analysis and that particular standard, the greater problem becomes one of thinking about how in those moments where we're evaluating African American males on the basis of this long-standing stereotype regarding black male criminality. What we should be saying is that in some of those instances, those African American males are not being criminal, they're actually being legal. They're standing up for their constitutional rights. They have a right not to be resisted, to not be searched or be seized in violation of the Constitution. And so it becomes, you see the narrative come out very quickly that sort of morphs into and connects to black male criminality, which is a long-standing part of our social conscience and our narrative in this country for it.
Thank you, Dr. Tibbs. We're going to move into Professor Gottschalk, who can talk to us a little bit more about this narrative that we just heard from Dr. Tibbs and how that narrative comes to, who's responsible for that narrative, who's responsible for changing it, and how that narrative has played into the role of the police department's mistreatment of African American communities of color, or communities of color, I should say.
So let me do what my students like to do, answer the question they want to answer, right? So let me talk about how to change the narrative, right? We need more prosecution of these cases. But as Professor Tibbs showed us, the barriers to successful prosecution are so very, very high. It doesn't mean you don't go to court because you're going to lose, but you need to be realistic that if the end game is to reduce the number of deaths by police, going to court, trying to prosecute our way out of this is not going to work. So the question of changing the narrative, if you look at police departments, we have a great range of the death rates of civilians. In New York City, the rate is about 2 per million. And in places like Bakersfield, California, Orlando, Stockton, it's about 10 times that, more than 20 per million. So it's not about if you prosecute more. In Philadelphia, we haven't prosecuted anybody in 17 or 18 years for police killing, yet we've seen a drop in the killings in Philadelphia. Not to 0, but they've dropped significantly. So if we're going to change the narrative, a few things I would say is, first of all, training and the rules of engagement can change. So we teach people, we spend about 20 times as much time national teaching people about use of force compared to de-escalation. We do very little training about mental health. In some police departments, people get 6 weeks of training and then they go out and they're a police officer. And they're young, right? You're giving a gun to a 19, 20, 21-year-old with 6 weeks of training. In Norway, they get 3 years of training. We don't require often that you give a verbal warning. We don't require that you don't shoot to kill. We don't require that you take a range of what the situation is and then escalate the force. If it's a knife versus an AK-47, you can have a different rule of engagement. You can have a rule of engagement. The Supreme Court says, yes, you can shoot someone in a fleeing car because it can be considered a deadly weapon, but you can make a rule that unless someone is firing from a car, you're not allowed to shoot them. We can also talk about the bigger issue of less militarized policing. But where training shouldn't focus on, and this is really hard to accept, focusing on implicit bias and putting a lot of resources into that is not going to reduce police shootings. We don't have any real data. It's about changing the rules of the game. And what we also have to think about is that it's about police violence, not just police violence against people of color. That we have extraordinary levels of violence in the United States in police killings. They just happen to be more extraordinary against people of color. Just to give you an example, if you're in Denmark, you're 18 times, the United States versus Denmark, you're 18 times more likely to be shot by the police in Denmark than you are in the United States. Right? If you're a white person, it goes down to 16 times more likely, right? And if you're black, you're 40 times more likely in the United States versus Denmark. But there's still a very high rate of state violence. And if we want to talk about violence, we need to talk about state violence and not community violence. Because what we do know is that the rates of shooting do not correlate with the rates of violence in communities. So some of our most cities with the highest rates of violence, like Newark and Detroit, have relatively low levels of police shootings. And some communities like Bakersfield, Long Beach, California have actually high rates of police shootings. We need to reduce police contact, so we need to stop and frisk. We need to reduce the probation and parole population. We need to tell people you will not be sent back to prison for a technical violation or for not paying your child support, as in the case of Walter Scott. So you're not going to have people fleeing.
Microphone closer to you.
No,
And I do have a question.
Yeah.
Mary.
Yeah.
I mean, so I love what you're saying in terms of police training and other things that will help reduce some of the violence. But when I talk about narrative, right, recently we've seen a different narrative showing different things. So some of the tactics and the training that you talked about have been exposed to the Black Lives Matter movement. In terms of when there is a non-minority person, the police sometimes in the videos that were shown by Black Lives Matter seem to understand those training tactics. If a person has a knife, they're able to de-escalate the situation where death doesn't result. However, the Black Lives Matter movement has created a different narrative and has pulled more consciousness to this issue that has, I think, been more effective in getting things, in making things better, or making progress. And so that narrative has been very important because it's gone out and became a household discussion. And if you can talk about how those things play into the mindset of people who accept certain behaviors and who demand different things in their communities, I think that is really important because we haven't been talking about it this way until the Black Lives Matter movement came about.
It's Black Lives Matter with the videos, right? And what Black Lives Matter has shown us is the importance of transparency and accountability. So I feel like I've been doing criminal justice for decades, and I was actually surprised that we don't have good data on how many police shootings actually happen, and we had to rely on the Guardian newspaper and the Washington Post to sort of come up with those numbers, and we don't have a requirement for the Department of Justice to count those and to look at what the conditions were in those shootings. And Black Lives Matter has pushed those issues. I think they've also pushed the issue of soft public safety versus hard public safety. That in fact, more police don't necessarily make you more safe. And that the safest communities, as we know, have better parks, have after-school programs, have lots of people who are not locked up so that they can, the dads and the moms and the uncles and the brothers can be doing that informal social control in the community. And I think Black Lives Matter has brought those issues to the fore.
So the narrative is important. Because
the narrative is absolutely important, but where I would like to say is what I hear many people say is, this is a Black Lives Matter issue, this is not my issue. And knowing what I know about the police, I would be hesitant to call the police, even as a white woman in certain circumstances, knowing, and I just had that recently where an alarm went off in my house, and the police come with guns drawn to go around, and my husband felt like, oh, this is fine, and I'm thinking about police shootings, and my husband's the person of color, and all those kinds of things were going off in my mind. And so we think of this as a Black Lives Matter thing, where in fact we have these high levels of police violence and militarized policing that we've all come to accept.
yeah, and I think that Black Lives Matter called attention to the specific things that were going on in the African American community, as they were the ones that needed a lot of attention at the time. It's like, I guess you can correlate it with, if your house is on fire and you call the fire department and they start spraying the house next door, and you say, why are you spraying the house next door? And they say, well, all houses matter. You say, but it's my house that's burning right now, they need attention on my house. And so that's where I think to make a distinction between how communities of color are policed and other communities. But with that, and I think that we can go into some data and research around that policing strategy, because what we've talked about is that this has become a norm or a narrative that police have to use certain tactics so that we're all safe. And if they don't use these tactics, if they don't shoot the Walter Scotts, he would come back and harm people because he owes so much child support. If Fernando Castro didn't smoke weed, or we didn't smell weed, then I wouldn't believe that he was dangerous and it was necessary for me to use that much force. But Professor Hannon, you've done some research and you have really shed some light on what's really going on in communities of color and policing practices and tactics that have been designed, and when I was a practitioner, stop and frisk was necessary to keep us safe. it was necessary for officers to check and make sure that people didn't have contraband, or else we'd all be in danger. What has your research found in terms of the narrative, but in terms of the real data that may suggest otherwise?
First let me say thank you. It's a pleasure. I will get into the statistics and the reality that I've uncovered in my research in a second, but I want to briefly give you an anecdote. Fortunately, one of my students is here, so this is about the teaching evaluations that I just got back. Luckily, this isn't from you, Julia. One of the comments really struck me. It was that if I had just 5 minutes left to live, I'd want to spend those 5 minutes listening to one of Dr. Hannon's lectures on social statistics. Because that way it would seem like hours. So if this seems like a really long answer, it's probably not as long as you think. So my Philadelphia-based research basically replicates 3 major findings that have come up with the New York data. But then it, of course, goes beyond those findings as well. But let me just give you some statistics that emerge in the Philadelphia data and are also present in the New York data. First, stops with frisks are rarely productive, very rarely productive. About 90% of the time, there's no evidence of any wrongdoing. They are extremely unproductive in terms of uncovering weapons. It is very, very rare for a stop with frisk to uncover a weapon. We're talking between 1% and 3% of the time. Second, like in New York, the Philadelphia data suggests that black people are especially likely to be frisked unproductively, in the sense that there's no evidence of any wrongdoing. So it's rare to start on average. It's rare for everyone, but it's really rare for African Americans. My statistical models suggest that the probability that a typical frisk of a black male will yield any contraband, and by contraband this is mostly drugs, is only about 9%, whereas a frisk of a white female has a 27% chance of uncovering something. This explains probably why we focus on white females. Third, it's not just black individuals, but also black spaces that appear to be racially profiled. Anyone stopped in a predominantly black place has an increased likelihood of being frisked and being frisked unproductively. So I found that in Philadelphia's majority black neighborhoods, they suffered 70% more frisks, 70% more frisks, yet those frisks actually uncovered less absolute contraband than in non-predominantly black areas. 70% more frisks to find less. But perhaps the most troubling finding from my research is that the violent crime rate significantly predicts the frisk rate in a neighborhood. And so, this is something that, has been pushed by police departments for a very long time. The stop and frisk isn't racially discriminatory. It's just, that black people and black places are more likely to be involved in crime. And so the police go where the crime is. I found that, there is a general relationship between the violent crime rate and the frisk rate, but it's driven by white neighborhoods. So in white neighborhoods, this idea of objective, reasonable fear, it's something that seems to be real. That is, there is an objective, reasonable fear in the sense that as the violent crime rate increases in a white neighborhood, your likelihood of being frisked increases. But in black neighborhoods, the violent crime rate is irrelevant for the likelihood of being frisked. So to me, it was like, that to me is the most disturbing of all findings, because what it suggests is like, just like for black individuals, for black places, they have less of a return to conformity. Sorry to speak like an economist there. That is, playing by the rules doesn't pay off for them. It doesn't protect them from police action. Now, like others, I believe stop and frisk as a proactive policing policy is just not justified by the evidence. I think there's very little evidence that stop and frisk can reduce crime, and I think there's a lot of evidence that stop and frisk has these collateral consequences, which in the long run may actually increase crime, but even besides crime, it's problematic in terms of public safety. It's problematic in terms of health and overall quality of life. Just want to get this out there because, when I suggested ending stop and frisk in a Philadelphia Inquirer interview a little while back, I got these emails from people being like, "Oh, you can't end stop and frisk because stop and frisk is not actually a policy. It's more kind of like an individual part of an officer's toolkit." And I just think, I understand that argument. I understand how it kind of relates, to the thinking, of the judges in Kerry versus Ohio. But and Tracy Mears is a great article on this exact issue. But to me, it just seems ridiculous to argue that stop and frisk is not actually like a policy when, like in New York City, we saw the prevalence of stop and frisk increase by 500%, and then decrease by 500% within a period of 12 years. And if you can increase something by that much and decrease it by that much, you can't claim that it's not driven by policy, that it's just some type of coincidence that all officers started using their toolkit and stopped using their toolkit at the exact same time. I think it's clearly a matter of policy.
I don't want to interrupt you because you are just on a roll, and I'm
Okay, so I think just, and the other thing is in Philadelphia, we also, from November of 2014 to November of 2017, we reduced our stock rate by 60%. And if you can reduce something by 60% and there's no consequences, there's no visible consequences in terms of crime, there's no visible consequences in terms of officer safety, then how can you tell me it's a necessary part of someone's toolkit?
All right. Well, I think we're coming to 5 minutes. All right. So we wanted to leave some room for questions and answers. But I do want to say that narrative that you just shared with us, I hope that makes it into Fox 29 News. I hope that makes it into 6 ABC News, because I haven't heard that being echoed by many people other than in people in this profession, and of course researchers. So when the narrative becomes more even-handed to reflect what's actually going on, we may start to see some minds change and pressure put on those who are in charge of creating these policies or practices. We're going to open it up for the next 5 minutes to anyone who has any questions of the panelists.
I understand the factors that Dr. Tibbs pointed out as the legal standards for conviction and so on. But I think a lot of the problem is that either district attorneys aren't interested in getting convicted, or they don't know how. Has anybody, to your knowledge, ever convened a group of trial lawyers with criminal law experience to sit down together and figure out how you can, what is the best practice to get conviction in these police shootings.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the answer to that is the public defender's office. I mean, they
But they're the other side.
right, but
They're defenders.
yeah, but they're trying to get the district attorney's office to understand what happens in these police-related shootings over and over again. There could be a variety of different factors that you can think about or might want to consider that might have an impact on why district attorneys, for example, are not successful in these cases. Number one could be the spirit of the team, for example, the spirit of the Corps, right? The main individuals that work for them as it pertains to conducting their investigations and that they work so closely with are actual police officers. You know, you also have issues related to internal affairs departments where you're basically asking the police to police themselves. That's like asking the mouse to guard the cheese. And then you also have the lack of information that is provided to communities that have oversight, are supposed to have oversight over these police-related shootings, and then the data that they would need to give them the information to be able to make decisions and to guide the police department is hidden from them. So there is a real problem in terms of the amount of information that is being processed and the way that it's being handled. And when you have the police department itself managing itself, it's almost impossible to prevent them from continuing to engage in some of the acts that they were engaging in. You also have the problems related to criminal prosecutors' offices, for example, that want to, you know, it's hard to be tough on crime, right? Hard to be tough on crime and be prosecuting police officers at the same time, right? That is a narrative that is very difficult to walk. And if you want to be a prosecutor, the prosecutor, before, just recently, it was almost impossible to run on a platform other than tough on crime. If you didn't say you were tough on crime, you just weren't going to get voted into office. And so you can't, to be tough on crime means to be tough not necessarily on crime itself, but to be tough on people. And the people that you have to be the most tough on are the people that Lance has just talked about a few moments ago. That is to be tough on people of color and to be tough on communities of color, all the while ignoring some of the opportunities to pursue crime and criminal behavior in other moments and in other instances. You will see drug raids in the black community long before you will see a drug raid on UPenn's campus, on Drexel's campus, on Temple's campus. We know it's there.
And then I could say it's like The Wire, it's like
Right.
Amsterdam, right? Because,
We
you
know
know,
it's
we
there.
have
And-
a free fire zone
And
there,
even
right?
if it's not drugs per se, we know there's underage drinking. We know there's sexual assault. We know there's tons of crimes that happen in those moments, but the police don't dispatch into those places to act with the same type of force that they go into, for example, North Philadelphia. So there's a variety of different reasons why it may be difficult to get the prosecutors to be able to do their job. I'm usually a lot more hard on prosecutors because I am baffled at how they lose some of these cases. I mean, baffled. Like baffled at how do you lose a Trayvon Martin case? I mean, I'm really, Philando Castile, how? Like, how do you lose the choking case of Eric Garner? Like, it has almost sent me into a negative space of saying one of two things. Either you're just not good attorneys, right? Or you're just disinterested in being successful in these cases. Both of which is a violation of the ethics of the practice of criminal law in this country, in any state.
Also, I think one of your questions are, once we get to the point where there's a jury trial and there is actually a process, why can't we get that last bit of justice? And I think we spoke about this on the phone in terms of the jury's perspective of in giving deference to an officer, because they do view crime as a problem that if officers are not able to use whatever weapons and tools that are at their disposal, then we would be less safe. And so oftentimes that narrative goes into the mindset of the jurors. I did have a discussion with the Florida State's attorney in the Trayvon Martin case, who did tell me that the standard there was for the jury to decide whether or not George Zimmerman, given who he was in totality, was in a subjective state, in a reasonable fear of his own life. Now, you have to step into the mind of George Zimmerman to do that, right? And so that is what the jury instructions had, and the way it was described, I don't know if it was, debunked by the prosecution, that it still should be reasonable, right? And he can't be unreasonable. We're not here for an incompetency trial.
I actually thought, in the aftermath of that case, that the bigger problem was the charging, right? Like, it seemed to me that the prosecutor overstepped the boundaries in a case by trying to charge second-degree homicide, which requires that analysis, as opposed to negligent homicide or manslaughter, where the only thing that you really have to prove is when the dispatcher says, "I don't think I need you to do that," and he goes and does it anyway. There it is, right? That is the basis and the standard. So we get into these moments of overcharging, and that could have something to do with the narratives that are being driven by the media and pressure and things of that nature as well. But I thought it was an overcharge from the very beginning.
I'm sorry, I have to go.
So I have a question for Mr. Lance. When you said, I quote, playing by the rules don't protect them, who are you talking about? What does that mean?
So, for individual African Americans, they are more likely to be physically frisked when there's no evidence of that they committed any sort of wrongdoing. So, they're acting lawfully, they're conforming, they're playing by the rules in that sense, and yet it doesn't help them avoid intrusive, abusive treatment by the police. And that's the same for African American communities. So at both the individual and at the neighborhood level, it's almost like, it doesn't pay to play by the rules.
Thank you.
We have time for one last question.
There's a sense that there's been an extraordinary growth in the number of police officers who are coming to the police departments out of military positions in which a lot of their training is, in effect, policing in a non-constitutional environment. Has that been studied, and is that how significant a contribution is that growth of military-based policing in creating a situation for violence and unrestrained breach of
It's not only the training, but it's also the equipment. So we look at mass incarceration and the militarization of police, and initially it's traced to a de-escalation of the Vietnam War and all that military hardware coming back. And then the Obama administration for a long time gave a pass to these grants to bring military hardware in, and until we had the Ferguson uprising, they put a hold on those grant military hardware, and then now with the Trump administration, that's coming back. But we do have evidence, both also of correctional officers who are also coming from a military background, and they go into the prisons with some of the same problems.
And I'm drawing a blank on the first name, but I believe the last name is Balco. And he wrote a book called The Rise of the Warrior Cop, I think it was Stephen Balco. And that's a great read, and I think it will help you uncover some of the...
Did you talk about Mark?
I'm sorry, Stephen Balco, I believe is the last name. The book is called The Rise of the Warrior Cop. And it's a great read for the answer to the question of where the militarization of the police actually came from and how it existed in some historical context into the present.
All right, so that's all the questions, the time that we have for questions, but I just would ask the panelists to offer one practical solution to make progress in the areas that you spoke about. If you can start.
All right. Quickly, I would argue that, again, this is something I told in my class, and so each of you is adherence, but the most important thing you can do to make things better is to stop making things worse. So I would argue that proactive policing should be limited to what we know works. That is, like you should follow the kind of the underlying principles, underlying philosophy behind medicine. First do no harm. But for law enforcement, it seems like it's, the first rule is do something. That needs to change. It should be reactive policing until we have a formula for proactive policing that is evidence-based. And then second, I think that we need to not focus on just short-term gains in crime. That shouldn't be the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal should be public safety, a notion of public safety that expands beyond just crime as a threat to a citizen's well-being. We need to recognize that crime is one variable, but there are other variables that matter. So an expansive definition of public safety, an evidence-based approach, and less proactive policing until we can figure all this out.
Thank you, President.
So the historian in me would say that we've been down this road before. We've been in a time period in life where there was a law, a set of laws, common practices, and policies built upon race and racial stereotypes, and it was Jim Crow segregation. And what we should not forget is, and as insurmountable as that may have seemed from 1896 to 1954, we toppled it. And one of the ways that it was toppled was through the work of activists and lawyers coming together. It took approaches from both sides, working tandem. It took Charles Hamilton Houston to come up with a strategy to basically financially bankrupt Jim Crow segregation. It took lawyers like Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP Criminal Defense Fund to be able to go out and try the cases, and it took the activists of the civil rights movement to actually present the opportunity for the cases to come forward in the first place. So I would say lawyers and activists, please continue to work together. When you work together, that's where the rubber meets the road, and we can take this down by working.
Let me build on what was said by my predecessors here. I think the activists and the lawyers need to focus on prosecution, but also changing the rules of engagement. Because if you change the rules of engagement, you can fire police officers. And even though arbitration is tough and police come back, even in Philadelphia, about a third of them who appealed their cases remained fired, right? They were not able to come back. And the other piece of it is if you have these written rules of engagement, as we've seen in other police departments, the shootings have gone down. And it also makes it possible to sue on the civil side in court, especially if the state legislatures say you will not have limited liability as a police officer if you're doing something against the rules of engagement that are in your police department. So if you shoot at somebody who's in a fleeing vehicle, then you are not going to have that limited liability anymore. And prosecution is very, very important symbolically for the families, for the communities. But the legal levels are so high, and even having better prosecutors, it's going to be really, really tough. And if we want to reduce those deaths in the shorter term, and when I think about prisons, I think about police departments. If you've been inside one prison, you've been inside one prison. There's a lot of variation. One police department. Yes, there are lots of problems with the police, but there's great variation, and we need to look at what is working in some police departments. And movements also need to put pressure on the Department of Justice to go back in and look at these police departments in a way that the Trump administration has basically said hands off to police departments and putting outside pressure on police departments.
Thank you so much for this enlightening discussion.